My name is Roisin Ryder. I'm in the Rialto branch of the SWP. I'm a community worker and an activist in People Before Profit. You're all very welcome this afternoon. Some of you have attended the meetings before, probably know some of the rules, right? But the main one is please turn off your mobile phones and put them on silent. The second thing, just to ask you, is this meeting is being filmed, and we'd like to also film the contributions because they're as valuable as the speakers. So is that okay? If there's anyone that objects, they can say it. There's no problem at all. Is there? Okay, so Nigel will be turning the camera around. Today's meeting is on Marx, Freud and mental health, and Padre O'Grady is going to be speaking. The format will be speak for 35 minutes, and that'll give us plenty of time then for discussion, and then if there's any particular questions at the end, Padre will come back. So if that's okay, and if you wouldn't mind all the contributions to go to myself, it's a big meeting, and just to give everyone a chance. So if you're going on too long, I might ask you to hurry up if there's a lot of contributions, so sorry about that. So Padre is a member of the Drimna branch of the Socialist Workers' Party. He's a child psychiatrist, and he's also a doctor of choice. So without further ado, Padre.
Thanks. Right, so see if we can get through a bit of Freud and Marx and mental health. It may seem strange, we're talking about two 19th century thinkers. Here we are in 2013, why would that be? And I'm going to argue it's because we're grappling with a lot of the same issues that Freud and Marx are kind of the exemplars of in many ways. I don't want to get lost in saying these are the only two thinkers. But I think one thing that we have to explain is, why is it that with developments in the quality and standard of living in many ways, in terms of nutrition, in terms of housing and health, or what is at least possible as opposed to what people actually experience, why is there still such a high incidence and high rate of mental suffering? And why have there not been the same advances in dealing with mental health in health services as there have been in other areas of health and healthcare? And I'm going to argue that one of the reasons, particularly for Marxists, is because there is an almost total ignoring of social factors, and particularly the role of capitalism and the effects of capitalism as a social factor is almost entirely missing from the mental health debate. I mean, to start with a very standard and reasonably orthodox understanding of the causes and even the cures for mental health problems, i.e. problems we experience at a mental level in terms of thoughts and feelings and our immediate behaviours. The most orthodox view of this in some ways, popularised by a guy called Mayer, of bad skin, back in the 19th century, the biopsychosocial approach, that we will understand ourselves in terms of our physical, our mental and our social being, which is not a bad way of looking at it. So let's have a look and see how we're doing. Someone criticised the biopsychosocial approach recently by saying, well, actually it's turned out to be the bio approach. So there is a domination of biological and physical factors when we come to try and understand mental health, but also when we try to engage. So why would this be? If we look at the and again, I'm going to be fairly sweeping. People can come in with more detail, and I'm not trying to imply things are as sweeping as I'm going to state them, but I'm going to start with some sweeping things. The most sweeping description of the dominant model of how you get mental distress and mental health dysfunction is that distress is an individual problem. The individual has a chemical imbalance in his brain, and the main reason why they have a chemical imbalance is because they have inherited some dodgy genes from their parents and ancestors. That's pretty much it. Now, and it works in both directions. Look the other way around. The dodgy gene produces some dodgy chemicals, i.e. proteins, which don't work in the way that they should do, and you become either depressed or disorganized in some way that we then have to cope with out in society. Now, why is this such a dominant idea? Is it that there's loads of evidence for it? No, there isn't an awful lot of evidence for this. I think that what it does is two things. One, it is a way of distracting us from any element of social or psychological cause. Anything in society or anything in our lived life experience can now just be ignored. because you just have a load of dodgy chemicals in your brain, and if we get the balance right, twist your little switches and knobs and so on, we can adjust it. I think this is very convenient because it means, and it's almost like a trade-off, we will say you inherited and you couldn't help it, so that we can avoid maybe looking for any deeper causes like poverty, inequality, or the way in which society is run. We will avoid looking at those things. Secondly, it gives a model of control to the authority, the medic, the doctor, and the institutions in which they live. And finally, and quite importantly in terms of the cures, it is a way of justifying the predominance of drug solutions to our problems. We earlier had a meeting about drug abuse, and earlier a problem about homelessness. And there's the notion that we use drugs too much is certainly trumpeted in areas of recreational drug use, but is almost not mentioned in areas of prescription drug use. That there is a massive increase. I mean, since the 1980s, I work with children. Before the 1980s, using drugs to control children or to deal with their distress was a very, very rare event, and the majority of people working in the field didn't agree with it. Way less than 1% of children on drugs. In lots of clinics now where children go with problems of development or distress and so on, you find that 40, 50, 60%. In the United States, 10% of children are on a Class A drug that only chemists can distinguish from cocaine, as I heard it put earlier, which I think is a very nice way of putting it. That if you took methylphenidate, known as Ritalin, the brand name, and you took cocaine, I really would not know unless I took your blood and had it sent to the chemist, to the laboratory, which one you had taken. Now, is this because in those 20 or 30 years there has been a massive advance in our understanding of how drugs are useful in the treatment of mental health? And what I'll argue is absolutely not. Absolutely not. What we have seen is the development of a massive increase in the use of drugs driven by drug company profits, and a rather helpless mental health services, desperate to find things that they can do and they can use as in some sort of explanation of giving some sort of assistance. To be clear about drugs, for the majority of uses, the placebo effect dominates, i.e. there is no particular difference observed between someone who thinks they're taking an active drug and someone who is actually taking it. The long-term outcomes, particularly for the use of drugs, may show some improvements in symptoms, in some symptoms, but not in the sorts of outcomes that all of us would be looking for from a release from mental distress, which is that we live a life where we live somewhere decent, we have something interesting or rewarding to do during the day, or anything to do during the day, i.e. a job, decent housing, and a network of friends and family to support us. These outcomes with the long-term use of drugs are worse than societies in which they don't use drugs at all. Right? So again, long-term outcome studies, we can't see for the majority of conditions, particularly the mild and moderate, i.e. the vast majority of mental distress, things like the so-called antidepressants, which really are just stimulant drugs, or the more sedative drugs, or mood regulators. There are very few examples of solid evidence in a minority of patients that these things are in any way helpful. The side effects are often completely ignored. With some of the more sedative major tranquilizers, neuroleptics or antipsychotics as they're called, which it's debatable that they are, there's evidence that they actually reduce the amount of life that you live. They can shorten your life by up to 10 or 15 years, and also that they cause changes in your body metabolism leading to diabetes, being overweight, heart attacks and so on. And all of these side effects are put down, and all of these supposed benefits, particularly symptomatic but ignoring the more meaningful outcomes, are all used to hide the fact that we're really going nowhere fast in the use of drugs for mild, moderate and even severe mental distress. And finally, a covering up of the issue of withdrawal. One of the most reinforcing things in society is that people find when they stop the drug that they relapse. In fact, what happens for a lot of people when they stop the drug, because they haven't been told about the tendency of a body to accommodate to, to tolerate a drug means that when you stop it, you start to experience a withdrawal from the drug. Anybody who's ever drinking heavily and stopped, anyone who drinks coffee, actually it's a very good example. You drink coffee every day of your life for 3 or 4 years. For anyone who smokes and who stops using the stimulant, all of a sudden, what will happen? You will become depressed. You will become agitated. You will become really distressed, and you'll really want to go back on the drug, even though nobody's telling you this is an antidepressant. Okay, and it is one of the ways that drug companies hide the fact that their drugs don't work, is that they encourage the confusion between withdrawal and relapse. There is also, you can see a lot of the prejudice around mental health and the economic base for the interest in mental health to sell drugs, but also in terms of work. If they are interested in us getting back to work and feel that the level at which they can exploit our labour, that they can make profits out of us, they want us to get back to work quickly. And there's a certain interest in dealing with mental health problems from that perspective. If, on the other hand, they feel that our mental distress is too much and will be too long term, their inclination is to want us to be abandoned and dumped from the workforce. And you can see even a prejudice in whether you give stimulating drugs to the ones you want to get back to work, or sedative drugs to the ones that you want to just get out of the way and not cause too much problem. And the key issue is whether or not there is a profit to be made out of that workers' labour or not. That is one of the major concerns. And also importantly, if they're going to use up the time and efforts of the carers, who could, instead of being busy minding someone that they care about with mental distress, are going to be kept out of the labour market. So a lot of the reasons and the interest in mental health from the point of view of our rulers and our employers have to do with exploitation, have to do with either getting us back to work so they can continue to exploit us, or just dumping us out of. And it explains a lot of the history of institutions, or dumping them in low-cost housing and leaving them open to exploitation in low-paid jobs, or just unemployed as a warning to others. So let's look at then, there's the domination of the biological model. So ideological in terms of getting us away from any social, let's not ask any social questions, and let's make lots of profits for drug companies on solutions that are debatable at best, with lots of evidence increasingly that they actually do no useful good in the vast majority of people and actually cause a lot of problems. So in terms of the psychological, I just want to use Freud as an exemplar. I don't want to get into a big debate about Freud. I think he's quite an interesting character. I think there are some features of his thoughts that were quite progressive, and I think there were some features of his thoughts that were quite conservative. Progressive first, I think the notion of moving from a situation where man was, and particularly ordinary people, not just men, were thought of as in some way quite animalistic, and just the common or garden Joe So was some sort of mechanical being just reacting to stimuli, food, need, sleep, sex, and that they were driven in some sort of mechanical way, or on the other hand, that we were all angels inspired by God in some sort of mystical way that nobody could understand. And Freud was quite progressive in trying to explain human behaviour and human experience in material terms, based on bodily needs on the one hand, but also on a mind that was dynamic and that was largely unconscious and influenced by lived experience, which we then remember and is available in our everyday working lives to influence us. So that notion of a dynamic mind and not a simple mechanistic or mystical spiritual explanation for human beings was progress in the late 19th century. The notion of continuity between normality and mild mental health problems was also a progressive notion, rather than the notion that you had over on one side the mentally distressed and defective, and then everybody else, the normals. The notion that a lot of people experience distress at a level that could be understood in terms of lived experience rather than some brain lesion or chemical imbalance. Thirdly, the person's subjective experience, their own feeling, their own story of what had happened to them is central to the best traditions of psychoanalysis and more broadly psychotherapy, or the talking cure. The notion that indeed talking, what Marx referred to as practical consciousness, the notion of how your thoughts become real when you share them with somebody else or when you act. But one of the actions that is in between is the notion of talking about your experiences, your feelings, the thoughts and ideas that you have. And so the notion of the trust and cooperation between the person suffering from mental distress and the person trying to help of whatever kind is a central feature of the best elements of psychoanalysis. And when you see a corruption of psychoanalysis, you find that it is indeed trust and cooperation that are the things that are in some ways circumvented or ignored. The conservative side, I mean, what he's famous for is having promoted the notion that life experience was very important, particularly the experiences in early childhood were very formative and influenced us in powerful ways, and that any trauma during that early experience was vitally important. And because he believed those things, people started to tell him about some of the experiences they'd had as children. And he started to listen and to believe them. But he found that the experiences, which we now know, if we look at things like the Savvy report, 10 or 15% of people experience very significant abusive experiences, and that's only in the area of sexual abuse, also physical abuse, emotional abuse, and so on. But these things are common. And I think Freud became so, in many ways, distressed by this, and particularly his colleagues became quite distressed by this. And even though he looks to explain it then, that there must be, if it isn't happening, that there must be an explanation in why an adult would fantasize about having been abused as a child. Now, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. I do think the much more important deficit in Freud, as well as his concessions around the issues of child sexual abuse and his quite dodgy ideas at times about women and sexuality, and the predominance of sexual instincts and sexual impulses and sexual needs as the dominant motivating force in life. I think he overemphasized that. I think what he underemphasized was the role of social factors outside of immediate experience, which Freud himself, I think, was the first to explain that he didn't know much about. And he didn't, and it was a weakness of his theory. Now, mind you, he was surrounded by people like Adler, and I mean, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a socialist movement. There was Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. He does not seem to have engaged at any depth, and I think he can be criticised for that. His notion of history is often quite mystical. He goes on about Primal Man. I mean, what exactly? I mean, even when I'm trying to read him, trying to figure out what he even might be talking about, it could be anything from, ancestors of humans, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, apes, all the way up to hunter-gatherers or even early horticulturalists or agriculturalists. It's hard to know what he means by Primal Man. But he sets up this artificial conflict between the individual and society in a very abstract, ahistorical way. Not as Marx would talk about real people living in the real world in real time, having real experiences. He invents these slightly mystical primal fathers murdered by their sons and so on. But I think his particular weakness then is his underestimation, his overestimation of sex and later aggression, because he just doesn't understand where's the tension coming from. Why is there tension? Why is there tension about sex? And his explanations are largely that society demands that instead of running around enjoying yourself with lots of sexual activities or things that have to do with pleasure, because you want to enjoy the fruits of a more organized society, which he refers to as civilization, we put that to one side. We sublimate our sexual desires into work. And this is partly because Freud had a very weak understanding of work as potentially a pleasurable activity. And that is, of course, because in our world, most of us experience work as not a great source of pleasure to ourselves. It's like the status quo. Richard Bentel, in his book, he describes how difficult it is not just to detect a connection between something rare and a mental health problem, which you can imagine, it's very rare, you mightn't see a connection. But it's also very hard as well to make a connection between something almost universal and very common. And one of the examples he gives is, if everybody smoked exactly 20 cigarettes a day all of their lives, we might miss the fact that smoking is one of the major causes of lung cancer. Because we wouldn't notice it. We'd say, oh, yeah, did he smoke? Yeah, he got lung cancer. Yeah, it makes sense. Because everybody smoked, you wouldn't notice it. So universal conditions of not enjoying your work means that Freud really doesn't look into that, and because of his, I think, avoidance of social factors, doesn't look into it in more detail. So onto Marx. So Freud, he emphasizes life experience and the importance of looking into subjective experience and taking it seriously, but looks at the individual versus society. And the life and death instincts. I mean, he largely invents the death instinct, I think, because the First World War happens and he has no idea of imperialism, which is obviously another meeting. But in the absence of that, believes that the drive to aggression and violence is much more powerful than he had previously understood. Marx understood that people experienced at their own personal level distress and conflict. But he also started with man's experience or people's experience in the real world and knew that there are conflicts in the real world that can impact on us, whether we directly experience them or not. And he starts then with, like Freud, an understanding that our physical needs are crucially important. In fact, if we don't keep our physical needs, we can't experience any of the higher elements of thinking. If you're hungry, you're going to be dedicated to getting food. You're not going to be able to consider some of the finer things in life and engage in debate and science and art and so on. But he also recognized that throughout history, the way in which we therefore produced, which obviously became a central concern of humans, I mean, production and reproduction. Freud was focused big time on reproduction, which the species would cease to exist if we stopped doing that. So there's this very powerful feeling of an impulse to engage in sexual behavior because we need to reproduce. There is also a powerful impulse to produce, otherwise we die. But Freud didn't really have that sense because he didn't start in that same practical way as Marx does. And Marx understood the notion of how, given the change in history, as we move from hunter-gatherers, hunting and gathering fruits and nuts and so on, to a more class-based society through the development of agriculture and on into feudal and capitalist times, there is a tendency to move from collective to a division into classes and an elite who make decisions about production and who engage in mental labour, and a working class who do the work and don't get to make the decisions so much. And what he talks about in terms of alienation, and I want to go on to this, one of his central theories that helps us understand, I think, some of the mental distress we experience, is that alienation is a thing in the outside world, in the way that thunder and lightning are in the outside world. Except that alienation is a feature of human organisation. Alienation is about a division in society in the way that we produce things. Okay? So that as class society developed, there was a division between who decided and who did the work. But there was still some relative control over your production. If you were a peasant in the 13th century, when you had finished producing, the Lord might take some of your produce, but what was left, you had to decide what to do with it. You could consume it, you could trade it, you could sell it, you could barter it, but it was yours to do with what you could find to do with it. And some of the decisions about what you made and what you did and so on were relatively under your control. With the development of capitalism, we see a movement where the ownership of the means of production, i.e. the factories, the tools and so on, between you as a worker and everybody else on the planet. And those divisions, those key divisions, we think of class divisions as causing things, but what caused class divisions? And what causes class divisions is some people who are able to control production and some people who are not. And under capitalism, this has become almost entirely complete. The vast majority of the human population in 2013 has no control over production. Production is something decided in boardrooms. Okay, so I'm going to talk quickly in the last 10 minutes on some of the obvious mental health. I'm going to try and break it down. Some obvious mental health implications of this division in society between people and the generalized loss of control, which is what alienation is. People often talk about alienation as if it's the effect on us, how we experience alienation. No, alienation is the thing itself. It's the division and the loss of control over production. Obviously, if you have competing blocks of capital, you have businessmen all in competition with each other. To keep up that competition, they have to exploit their workers. The more they get out of them for the least wages, the more exploitation there is, the better they do in order to survive. That means that workers experience pressure and they experience fear. They experience fear they won't get paid enough, they experience fear that they'll lose their job. That fear as well is reinforced by what we call oppression. Oppression, any form of oppression is obviously aimed, like sexism, racism, homophobia, designed to divide workers and to increase exploitation. Because as you're busy fighting with each other, you're not busy fighting back at the boss. But this fear in society leads to a division of workers in their relations with each other into either pathos and charity or prejudice and fear. And it's a bit like in any competitive situation. If you imagine people when they're desperate, you're in a bread queue and there's a shortage and you're trying to get to the top. Okay? If somebody is stumbling to get to the top, kindness could be the end of you, because you mightn't get to the end. Your tendency to show solidarity and kindness is weakened unless somebody looks absolutely destitute and falls and hurts themselves. You might think of helping them up. So we divide people into the absolutely hopeless and our competitors, which is most people, and this leads to a sense of desperation and competition and encourages the notion of seeing people as your competitor and your enemy rather than as your cooperator and your friend. The mental health effects of this are obviously increasing levels of anxiety, persecutory ideas. I mean, you're sitting there in a pub and you're hearing people, if they're talking about the lack of housing or unemployment, it wouldn't be that surprising if people start to mention particular nationalities or social groups or whatever as to blame. Why? Because they're looking for some reason to explain it, and they have a fear of the effects of shortage. The loss of control and the experience of exploitation, for most people, it means you feel undervalued in your job. If somebody's constantly trying to pay you less and get you to work more, and basically treating you badly, you're going to feel undervalued. If you feel powerless to change that, you have no say in your workplace about how things are organised, you may become hopeless about it, and people become depressed about the lack of control. It often impresses me that when people talk about depression, they can talk about it for a long time without ever mentioning their experience in the workplace. And the experience for a lot of people in the workplace is very depressing, and there's often almost no mention about it. If we look at the effects in the recession, which because of the alienation, the way in which production of, say for example, housing, has been alienated from need. It's made on the basis of profit. I heard workers in the 90s and the noughties talking about this was their pension. I said, no, house is like shelter and warmth and things, and where you meet people and maybe have some fun. When they start talking about it as being for other things, being for financial reasons, and people are starting to trade bundles of houses in very complicated gambling scenarios, you start to realise that the function of houses as somewhere people can get shelter is going to get lost. And as we heard this morning, the level of homelessness went up during the recession. Unemployment is very strongly associated with depression, hopelessness and suicide. I mean, one of the contradictions in our society is that there's only one thing worse than having to get up in the morning to go to work, and that's not having to get up in the morning to go to work. And this is a fundamental contradiction that lots of workers understand, and I think Freud didn't. The unfulfilled nature of our job as well also explains a lot of the mental health problems that we have in trying to replace that fulfillment with something else. The consumption of drugs, the consumption of food, the consumption of clothes, cosmetics, lifestyles, do-it-yourself, gambling, all of these things to fill the hole that we feel the need we have to feel fulfilled, that what we do makes a difference, to give meaning to our lives, will be filled and taken advantage of in an alienated system, where people are going, when we have a system that sees you only as a source of profit, then in the way that you then make profit through drinking alcohol or eating food, it doesn't matter what the health effects on you are. There will still be a promotion of that consumption for as long as it makes profit. And that leads to all manner of addictions and dependencies and so on. So finally, isolation and powerlessness. Isolation is really the poison of mental health, because it is so obviously attractive that when the world is really getting you down, that you withdraw from it. You withdraw from the public sphere and take some solace in the private sphere. But of course, in the private sphere, that can break down too, because it's small, it's often weak and weakened, and people are busy with their lives, and often people can find themselves increasingly isolated, increasingly hopeless, and increasingly desperate. And of course, because their own experience is that they are withdrawing, is a feeling of responsibility, self-blame, guilt, and a failure to make connections with others. So I would argue, to finish, the answer to isolation and powerlessness, which are a feature of the way in which our world is organised around production, not just consumption, but production. The isolation and powerlessness are a direct result of that, and the solution for it, instead of the individual solutions, must include not just the biological. If there are biological solutions to things, I'm a great fan of them. I'm a great fan of psychological solutions to things, like counselling and so on. But we must also look at the social solutions. And the answer to isolation and powerlessness, I would argue, is solidarity and power. Power, a thing that has a bad name. There's a famous expression that absolute power, or power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. For Marxists, for socialists, what we do is we refine that just slightly. It needs a few words added. Power for the elite corrupts, and absolute power for the elite corrupts absolutely. As a result, to remedy that, power for the majority deals with corruption, ends corruption, and absolute power for the absolute majority would be the beginning of an end to this. Inscribed, the famous slogan of the Communist Manifesto in the 1840s was, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." Now, it is clear that the chains of the 19th century, well, they've changed in their style and the technology and the nature of the workplace and the look of the world. A lot of the powerlessness that we have over production, over our world, in terms of what is produced, the polluting effects of it, the devastating effects of it, and even the control measures, that what we need is a major injection of democracy. Anybody who has ever looked at any of the studies of the development of even any ways to develop, rather than me stand up here telling you, we must develop mental health like this, the best advances in the development of ways to deal with mental health come from the ground itself. Democracy is one of the most powerful elements of developing, whether it's self-help groups or therapeutic communities, campaigns like trade unionists and socialists fighting back against sexism, fighting back against racism. These are destructive elements in society. That mass campaigns, mass mobilisations, and the injection of not just socialist theory, but also trade union theory and just campaigning theory, and pulling all of those things together so that organisations like Critical Voices Network, the Social Work Activist Network, health service campaigns, trade unionists and socialists working together is the beginning of the end. The beginning of the end for alienation and the effects of alienation on us is people power and democracy. It's only when we engage that power that we can truly start to see the notion of workers of the world uniting and getting rid of our mental, physical and social chains.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
It's a much larger meeting than we had in this probably the breadth of ideas that Pather has gone through, and also I think when you think of the austerity and the effects of austerity on our lives, and it shows, the effect of that on our mental health, and I think a lot of people are interested.
Some medical reports have now said something like 90% of people living in these centres suffer from depression or insomnia. They're also 5 times more likely to suffer from mental illness. I interviewed a number of people in these centres. Many of them have insomnia. Many of them take antidepressants. They're sometimes in these centres for over 3 years waiting for a decision, and over 95% of the time they're going to be rejected. So they spend 3 years of their life every day waiting for a decision. Second, they live in very isolated, remote areas. Thirdly, they are not allowed to work. I mean, if you want any form of evidence to sort of, reinforce this point of powerlessness and isolation leading to psychiatric problems, I think that's one mental manifestation. Secondly, just another very, very good point. This book, The Spirit Level, has tried to show, I mean, it's a very problematic book in a number of ways, but it does try to show that societies where there's more cooperation, people, more state protection towards individuals, less entrenchment of neoliberal values, these societies have less mental health problems and less issues to do with things. That's all.
No, I hope that's okay.
It's okay with you, yeah.
I'm on medication for depression and schizophrenia, and I was very shocked to hear Pather say that kind of medication can take 10 to 15 years off your life. Now, my family have told me they're afraid I'm going to die young because I'm so heavy. I'm a diabetic. I wasn't before I began my medication. I've also gotten worse symptoms since I started on my medication. I've never heard voices before I took antipsychotics, and after I took antipsychotics I began to hear voices. The problem is that if I now decide I want to come off my medication, and I do as of this minute, what do I do? Because I'm going to relapse. And I've tried to come off my medication in the past and I've relapsed. So it's like a merry-go-round. How do you get off it? That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much.
Well, I was going to talk about the happiness industry, but Pat's already covered that. But I suppose another point about austerity and mental health, and I think there was a real shocking show of hypocrisy from the current government. I think it was last Christmas, where the cabinet and members of the Oireachtas, wasn't actually just the government, got together to sing a song and have it recorded, and all the funds would go to Pieta House. And in the front row singing this song was Joan Burton and Brendan Howland, and it was just after the budget. It was just after they had cut funding to mental health services in particular. But the effects of austerity on mental health, Vanessa touched on it briefly, but I think that the cutting to all our social services affects people with mental health difficulties more than everybody else. Because if you think of what Peter McFerry was saying this morning about people in homeless services, and how the many myriad of reasons why you wouldn't go and stay in a hostel, and one of the things he pointed out was because many of the people who are homeless have been abused as children, because it is mental health service, people who are most vulnerable in society very much get caught even more by the effects of austerity than other people. And then just a question for Pather. There's always talk about ring-fencing money for mental health services, and whether he really thinks that's a good idea, because in just what Lola was saying about the stigma surrounding mental health, why do we see it as something different? Why isn't it just health? Why are we ring-fencing anything? And is ring-fencing money for mental health a way of actually cutting the budget for mental health? Why don't we just have a proper health budget? And mental health is just one of the aspects of it, in the same way as orthopedics or cancer or whatever, and I think they do get away with that. Just your report.
Thanks for that.
Asperger's, and I have Asperger's, and it tends to put people into, okay, you're in the spectrum, but you're here in the spectrum, and then other parts of your disorder are other places in the spectrum, and it really sort of compartmentalizes how you're thinking about what's going on in your mind, and how that relates to how you're learning about your own mental illness. And Padre, you were talking about power. And another source of power is knowledge. And if you can understand how your mind may differ than other people's minds, and you can read up about that, but you don't get that opportunity. You just say, okay, this is your symptom, that's it. You don't have this broader aspect of, okay, your mind works in a slightly different way than other people's minds, but you don't have the avenue to explore and really find out how you work in relation to how you work with the broader societal aspect of things. And it's just something that I wanted to comment about. It's that the compartmentalization of mental health is very, very destructive to one's own power. And another thing I wanted to say is that me joining the SWP, in terms of my dealing with Asperger's, has been hugely helpful, because I've found this network of people that have all different minds, and just go, yeah, people think differently. That's part of life. That's part of being a human. People do think differently than each other, and that's one of the things I've really found in the SWP, that people are really different, and it's cool, and it's awesome, and we should celebrate it. Just do this.
Yeah, it's just on the way we've kind of, I think a lot of people in the room agree that alienation has a huge contributing factor to mental health. The idea that we've no control over our lives, over production, what we do with our jobs, all of that, I think we've all probably felt at some stage of our life going mad in this job, doing this thing all the time. But another aspect to it that I think, and maybe Padre could throw some light on it, that hugely contributes to the mental health of young people, and it's a big aspect of the capitalist system, is the advertising industry, and how commodities, products, models, the way you're supposed to look, the sort of sex life you're supposed to have, the weight you're supposed to carry or not carry, the hairstyle you're meant to have, the clothes you're meant to wear, the fast cars you're meant to drive, the things you're meant to drink, the way you're meant to feel and relate to each other, is pushed on us, beamed at us from the time we're tiny, tiny little people. And there's a very good study done by an American woman, I can't remember her name, she wrote a book called Born to Buy. And she looks at how the advertising industry targets children deliberately to increase the amount of products that are sold. But they're not just targeting the children so that mommy will go and buy them the, sexy bra when they're only 9, or because this kind of shit goes on big way. Or, that they have to have the Nike runners that glow in the dark and all this. But they also target children to find out put pressure on mommy and daddy what to buy. Apparently, in America, 60% of parents make the decision about what car they buy according to the preference that their children decide. The kids say, the Volkswagen was on the telly last night, that looks cool, daddy get one of them. So this business of advertising plays a huge role in it, and I know so many young people who do not know who they are because shit is being beamed at them all the time. They think they're supposed to be skinny, blonde, sexy, but they might want to be a bit fatter, dark-haired and gay, and they don't feel any space for that to be allowed in them. So I think this puts an enormous amount of pressure on the human being as they develop psychologically. And again, it goes back to the same problem, that it's all about productivity being out of the control of the people who produce the wealth, the ordinary people, for the needs of the people rather than the benefit of the elite.
I just want to make 2 or 3 points. First of all, there was a doctor throughout the 20th century who said a person not coping or not able to cope with the capitalist system they have a correct response. And I think that's very telling, because what he was basically saying, he worked in the mental health industry. I can't remember what his name is. Padre, you might know. But what he was saying was that through process production, that if you can't deal with the alienation of society, if you have a mental break with what they're telling you is the right way to live your life, well then that's the correct response to have. Because we as human beings are actually naturally cooperative. Second thing I really want to say is that when you're talking about mental health issues, it's always important to know that they're not always transparent, they're not always immediate, and they're not always overtly severe. So, I mean, I know for myself, because I've always suffered with mental health issues. I was taken in at the age of 8 with manic depression. And I know for myself that I could walk down the street and I could say, oh, how are you? But I'm not really listening. And I know someone can say it to me, and my response is, oh, well, you know, I'm fine, I'm grand. And we don't actually have conversations as human beings. We're not able, even with our nearest and dearest, we're not able to have those conversations. And I think that's one thing that we have to break. And the final thing is, Pater mentioned Marx's theory of alienation, and it's very, very important in this discussion. But mental health worsens as the recessions worsen. Capitalism is a system of booms and busts, and as we develop, the booms are going to get bigger, and so too are the busts. And through that, mental health issues are basically pushed to the sidelines, and we don't talk about them. The narrative from the top down is to kind of ignore them. And I want to really look at why mental health issues actually become so prevalent in recessions. And mainly it's because everything that you grow up to believe, you find out to be a lie. In this recession, I remember when I was leaving school, I was working 3 jobs. And I was being told, get a loan, get a car, get a loan, go to college, get a loan, buy a house. And that was the main narrative coming out from the mainstream. And it was that whole idea: if you work all your life, you're going to be in a better position when you're older, and you'll be fine. Well, as we can see, pensions have been raised. We now have to work until we're 68, and even that they're trying to push up. I mean, this has a really, really big impact on individuals and in society themselves. So by individualising and blaming people, it's a way of keeping mental health issues as a personal problem instead of a societal problem.
Okay, to yourself first.
Thanks first of all for a very interesting talk, Pater. And I'd like to just throw in a couple of things. I come from a community gardening background, a network of about 30 or 40 community gardens in Dublin at the minute. I'd just like to comment maybe
Can you
on...
project your voice a tiny bit more, yeah?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'd like to comment on the connection maybe between food production systems and alienation. I think that it could be argued that food is one of our most fundamental needs, and that the disengagement of people from growing food is something that needs to be tackled maybe in a way. Over the course of the last few hundred years, we've been removed from the land. People are in cities, they don't recall how to grow food, or even prepare food or cook food. So I think that a way of kind of shortcutting this sort of alienation, or countering this kind of alienation that we're talking about, is for people to get involved in community gardens, to work collectively to grow food, and in that way to create changes, I think, in the here and now. I think that's a positive thing, and encourage people to contact their local community garden and spread the word, particularly for people who may be encountering various sort of mental illnesses. Gardening therapy is something that definitely works.
Rex Haig is a very interesting member of the Critical Psychology Network. Rex Haig in Berkshire, he's highly developed thing all around that, so you could Google him and get in touch. It's really fascinating because he's developed that in a big way in Berkshire. He's head of mental health in Berkshire.
Thanks for that. That's great. Pat,
Okay, yeah. Just a couple of comments on Pater's excellent talk with Pater. I think talk about the profits that come out of mental health. One of them obviously is drugs, it's the source of drugs. The other one, I think, ironically, is the happiness industry itself. I mean, if you go into any bookshop, you find, if you look at the search on the topic of happiness and self-help, you find stacks of books, all books to get how you can cure yourself, how you can get yourself out of the mess you're in by following A, B, and C. And the whole idea that there is this thing called happiness, or that there is an idea, an attainment that we can all achieve if we only try hard enough, is in itself a source of huge profits from that. And I think we should be challenging that, that Because what most of these books do is they set goals for yourself, which primarily, because of the problems that Pater described, the difficulty of getting by with the alienation of the world, it's very difficult to actually achieve these goals, which means that you get into a kind of a spiralist cycle of depression because you can't meet the goals that you've set yourself. And I think it's no coincidence that the whole product of positive psychology, if you like, is led by the main guru is a man named Spiegelman, who is basically a Thatcherite from the 80s, who argues that we should get away from the blame culture in society. We should focus on the individuals and look what you yourself are doing. And so that so there's that element to it. But the other thing I would agree, like we should be looking at alternatives in the here and now as well, because one of them, I remember I was doing a talk during the pensioners strikes. I know against when they went strike against the budget cuts, and you could see the fantastic solidarity that was there. So even those people were very angry, they were also very happy because they felt through solidarity they were actually achieving something, But I think the other thing, final thing I'd say is in terms of some of the treatments that are available, because it is the case that people suffering with anxiety, there are alternatives. And one of the most interesting phenomena that's going through the country at the moment is a huge interest in things like mindfulness, for example. Ways of alternative ways of dealing with anxiety through, basically in terms of reality. And I think it was a matter from the 60s, do not adjust your mind, the problem lies in reality. And I think that's a motto we should take with us in this as well,
Very quickly, first of all I want to say, people like Margaret and Cormac and Rory are heroes, I think, really heroes, because they're challenging the idea that mental health is their problem, that it's my fault, somehow I'm not good enough for this society and I have to shrink into the background and take drugs. I know some people have to take. You're a hero, that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is the solution. One is to sit in a room individually and talk about. But then you go back out into a world and you face an alienated world where every social relationship is framed around alienation. So what do? You get an hour of treatment and then you go back out for 143 hours of problem. Whereas what we want as socialists is we want to change that external context through struggle. And I think it's absolutely important that we move, look at the way people have talked today. Our mental health is being destroyed under capitalism. And I think, philosophically you can look at it from the point of view of, how do you affirm yourself under capitalism? You win, you beat people. I'm the most successful. What does that mean? It means that other people were not as successful as you, so therefore you should feel better about yourself than they do. Ipso facto, they should feel worse. So in other words, even the successful alpha people are ones who win at the expense of everyone else. That's a horrible way to live. To affirm yourself against other people is rotten. You should affirm yourself with other people. And we think in the Socialist Workers' Party you should get involved with us. I make no bones about it. I'm pleading with people. There's loads of people here I don't know their faces. So if you are passionate about other people's mental health and your mental health and your family's mental health, the best way to fight that is to get involved in revolutionary politics. Because when the government tell us we party too hard, we know it's not true. And we know that that's their fault because their rotten system causes the crisis that we have to fucking pick up. So therefore, if you join with us, you end up saying, actually, we're not part of it anymore. We're not taking their shit anymore and letting our mental health be destroyed. We're fighting their system, against their system for human development and for real people's needs.
Define sanity. As long as we are defining sanity, I'm happy.
Yay.
Because there are lots of definitions, and I particularly like the ones. The definition of health, happiness, fulfillment, meaning, all of those things are dependent on what time and place that question is being asked, but also who's doing the answering and in what kind of movement are they taking part. Because the stronger we are, the more powerful we are. And I'll come back to Leah's question, the last one that was asked. The notion of alienated mental health workers. Again, these divisions that we have between the well and the sick, between the physically sick and the mentally sick, between the service user or the patient, the old word patient, which wasn't such a bad word, because patient basically means the one who suffers. And it's a fundamental question to ask in mental health. Are they suffering? People have ended up in mental health institutions in the past for getting pregnant. And the big question was, why 30 years later were they still there? Bad enough they went in. These were NHS hospitals, not just Magdalen laundries. Okay, talk a little bit about stigma, because it's so important. I mean, the issue of disability and mental health, and like the comrade who talked about direct provision, there is a direct relationship between poverty and oppression and inequality and mental health. I mean, it's just so obvious. I mean, you get oppressed for whatever reason. You get exploited for whatever reason. It's going to affect your mental health. If it affects your mental health and you start to withdraw in the way that we talked about earlier, your ability to go to work, your ability to earn may be affected, and you become blighted by more poverty. As anyone caught in the trap of homelessness knows as well, when you lose your home, your chance of getting back into a job and back into a home becomes affected. I taught that story this morning by Peter McFarry of the people who, doing everything they can to get off drugs, Peter talked about people in methadone, who get off gear, go in, maybe into a residential program, go on the methadone, and then they're looking for a house to get their lives back together, and they are put into a room with other people taking heroin. I mean, it's just unreal. I mean, it's like trying to stay off booze where you live in a pub. It's just not really advised. Okay, but I think that the person who asked about the time factor, it really gets to the heart of why disability of any kind became an issue. Why were the disabled cleaved off from the working class? Because it did not suit our rulers for us all to be working together, caring for each other and working together in whatever way we can. I mean, Marx talked about in the future communist society, when we really are working as well, the distributive maxim would be to each according to their need and from each according to their ability. And I think that's a fantastic principle, that really what is part of the discrimination against the disabled is that their ability is not taken into account. And the disabled find they have two struggles very often. People with disability, or disabled people as lots are now called, because disability really is thrust upon you. It's not just about impairment. But they spend their time struggling to have their disability acknowledged, so that whatever need that they have to assist them in life can be recognised. And on the other hand, they find their struggle is trying to get their ability acknowledged, so that they can have that ability respected, and they can get a job. That the famous, very good film. I mean, you think of women and Freud's view of them. Freud could not see past the social nature of how women were disabled by the social structures of expectation on them. In the Second World War, we saw an absolute destruction of the notion of what women could and couldn't do, because suddenly they were required for production and they were Rosie the Riveter and driving trucks and buses. The less known version of that, of course, is that people with disabilities were taken into the workplace. Famous, I remember a film of the guy who visually impaired, fully 100% blind, and was ended up running the telephone exchange. Because he was the most experienced, as all the others went off to war, he ended up being the most experienced, ran it, and as soon as the war was over, they put him back as a telephone operator, and he wasn't allowed to do it anymore. But he set up a system of ropes so he could find his way around work. So with assistance, a kneeling bus, suddenly you can use transport. You know, I have lost the use of my legs. I mean, I can't drive. Now I can. You know, it's like there are, and that's obviously, and I don't mean to be trite, but there are ways around disability. Disability can, impairment, that's an impairment. Now, without those, I am also disabled. If I was in some ways persecuted and they wouldn't allow me to wear glasses, then I could start to talk about disability. It is, and the question was asked, why mental disability? I think partly because it scares people. It actually, when you do surveys of people with disabilities, the ones that they have the most fear of really are the mental disabilities. And I think, again, that is partly because of the denial of social factors. We tend to be afraid of things that we don't understand. And I would argue that if, the notion of if you don't want to lose your legs or have a major brain injury, don't join the army, okay? Everybody with me on that? Particularly don't join the American army, because they go and actively take part in killing people and bombing places. But for mental disability, it's a little harder to be clear on how that disability might come about. You know, trauma to your legs, trauma to your head. You can understand the connection with certain forms of disability. Mental disability, a little more difficult. Okay, I'm going to try and cover a few of the ones that... Suicide, what do socialists say? We say that hopelessness and despair has causes. And we have to stop denying that unemployment and low pay, poverty, unemployment and alcohol are all factors in suicide. All things we could do something about. Take the profits out of alcohol. We could ban advertising, as Breach talked about, making young people feel that it's not quite an occasion unless there's beer or alcohol or something in it, is an idea pushed by advertising. And there are plenty of things we could do about suicide. People Before Profit policy is a public work programme in order to avoid... I mean, one of the reasons why suicide isn't higher in Ireland is because young people are emigrating from Ireland, and that is saving them from suicide. That's a fact. So what do socialists say about suicide? There are social factors involved in suicide. There are plenty of things we could do if we cared as a society. And while we do, like, the vast majority of people care, and they care deeply, but they're not in a position... I mean, the notion that the government says we can't create jobs... Any fool can create a job. At the stroke of a pen you can create jobs. And you can get people into jobs with creative ideas of what exactly they can do with their skills. I mean, like we were saying earlier this morning, how do you solve the housing crisis? Build houses. Sorry. Like, in fact, to explain why we don't build houses takes a half an hour of a meeting. Right? Okay, quickly, ADHD, I could take a whole meeting. The notion that we are dealing with children with difficulties and treating them. 10% of American children are taking a Class A drug. It is quite extraordinary. I mean, it is about ignoring the needs of those children. It's about looking at something like just their activity level, but not even looking at their ability to move, their ability to process sensation. We have things like OTs, language therapists. We just don't have half enough of them. But it's much easier to go, So the child finds it difficult to pay attention and moves around a lot. So he's got difficult to pay attention, moves around a lot disorder. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I mean, you're just reflecting back what the person came and asked you about. It's like, I feel feverish, doctor. Oh, you have fever syndrome. I've got a pain. Oh, pain syndrome. And we treat it symptomatically rather than getting to the root cause, asking ourselves why these things happen. So I'm going to finish on gardening. Because we are in favour of all forms of partial solution. Now, the problem with some partial solutions, like drug taking, it's a solution to despair and distress. And it can be a solution that people can enjoy happily, whether it's medication or whether it's recreational drugs. But we know that partial solutions are partial solutions. If you push them too far, you get into difficulty with them. They don't answer the question. What is the nature of the problem? What are the roots of the problem? And how can we deal with those? So things like jobs, things like housing, things like counselling, exercise, gardening, mindfulness, yoga, we are all in favour of working class people accessing those things. I remember when I first ran for election so many years ago, I never did it again, one of the things we advocated was free gym membership for working class people. And there's people saying to us, what's that about? Middle class tosh, isn't it? We absolutely demand the best for our class. We want swimming pools. We want the best restaurants. We want the best gardens, the best parks, the best work. And if we were allowed to run society, we would have those things. We do not want to just put up, as Connolly said, our demands are quite modest. We only want the earth. We do not want to put up with we demand those partial solutions, but we are not prepared to put up with them. We need to control not just our consumption, we need to control our production. The answer to isolation and powerlessness is solidarity and power. We need to build that. Join the